The man in the faded barong Tagalog stood alone in the Oxford lecture hall, his brown hands trembling around a stack of papers held together by rubber bands. His name was Dr. Ricardo Cruz, a visiting scholar from a small university in Manila, and he had spent 3 years of his life writing a thesis on pre-colonial Filipino irrigation systems. He had flown 14 hours to present his findings, using his last savings, because his mother had sold her pig to help pay for the plane ticket. The hall smelled of old wood and foreign dust, and the British professor, Dr. Alastair Harrington, sat at the head of the table with silver hair and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Ricardo cleared his throat and began to speak about the rice terraces of Ifugao, how they were engineered over 2,000 years ago without metal tools, how they still fed entire villages today. He spoke with love, because his father had worked those terraces before him, and his grandfather before that, and the sound of water moving through stone canals was the first music he ever heard. Halfway through his presentation, Dr. Harrington chuckled out loud. It was a small sound, barely a cough, but it stopped Ricardo mid-sentence. The other scholars in the room turned their heads. Harrington leaned back in his leather chair and said, with perfect Oxford politeness, "Are you seriously comparing mud walls to Roman aqueducts?" He then asked Ricardo if his university had taught him how to use primary sources, or if they only taught folk dancing. The room went silent. Ricardo felt his throat close. He had prepared for questions about hydrology and anthropology, but not for this. Not for the way Harrington looked at his barong Tagalog like it was a costume. Not for the way the other professors smiled nervously, not wanting to offend the great British scholar. Ricardo opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked down at his thesis, at the pages he had rewritten 17 times by hand because his laptop broke and he could not afford a new one. He thought of his mother, waiting by the phone in Manila, ready to hear that her son had made them proud. He closed his folder, thanked the room for their time, and walked out. The heavy oak door closed behind him with a sound like a gunshot. He did not cry in the hallway. He walked past the portraits of dead white men in wigs, past the staircase where Stephen Hawking once rolled his wheelchair, past a janitor who nodded at him with the quiet kindness of someone who had also been looked down upon. Ricardo pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped into the Oxford rain. The cold hit his face like a slap. He had no umbrella. He had no coat. He had spent his last pounds on a room in a hostel near the train station, a room with no window and a mattress that smelled of bleach. He walked for 40 minutes without knowing where he was going, his thesis pages pressed against his chest under his barong, the ink starting to blur from the rain soaking through the fabric. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his younger brother, June, who worked as a security guard in a Manila mall, standing 12 hours a day in boots that did not fit. June's message said, "Kamusta, kuya? Did they like your paper?" Ricardo stared at the screen until the rain made it too wet to read. He typed back, "They loved it." He put the phone away and sat down on a wet bench near a canal that looked nothing like the canals his father had built. A group of Filipino students walking past recognized his barong. They stopped. One of them, a young woman with braces and a bright yellow backpack, asked if he was okay. He said he was fine. She did not believe him, but she did not push. Instead, she handed him a handkerchief and said, "Sige lang pa, sir. Proud pa kami sa inyo." "It's okay, sir. We are proud of you." She walked away with her friends, and Ricardo pressed the handkerchief to his face, not to wipe the rain but to hide the way his mouth twisted open in silence. That night, he could not sleep. The hostel mattress squeaked every time he moved. The windowless room felt like a grave. He opened his thesis and read the page where he had written about the hydraulic engineering of the Ifugao people, how they used gravity and friction and the natural slope of mountains to move water across impossible distances. He had calculated everything himself, using a calculator he bought from a sidewalk vendor. He had walked the terraces for 6 months, measuring canals with a rope because he could not afford a laser rangefinder. He had interviewed farmers who could not read but who could predict rainfall by the behavior of ants. He had poured everything into this paper. And a man in a tweed jacket had laughed at him. Not at his ideas. At him. At his country. At the idea that a Filipino could teach Oxford anything. Ricardo closed his eyes and saw his mother's face. She had not gone to school past the age of 10. She had learned to read from a neighbor's Bible. When he told her he wanted to be a scholar, she had said, "Anak, I do not know what that is, but I will carry water for you." And she had. She had sold vegetables, washed clothes, borrowed money from loan sharks with interest rates that made her cry at night. All so he could sit in a library and read about water. And now he was in Oxford, sitting on a bed that smelled of strangers, with a laughing sound still echoing in his skull. He picked up his phone again. He had one international call left on his prepaid card. He dialed his mother's number. It was early morning in Manila. She answered on the first ring, because she always did. "Ma," he said. His voice cracked. "Ma, I'm sorry." She did not ask what for. She said, "Ricardo, you come from a line of people who carved mountains with their bare hands. No man's laugh can undo that." He wanted to believe her. But the rain kept falling outside, and the walls of Oxford kept standing, and somewhere in a warm room, Dr. Alastair Harrington was probably drinking tea and telling his colleagues about the little man from the little country who thought mud was engineering. The next morning, Ricardo woke up before the sun. His eyes were swollen. His throat was raw from the silent screaming he had done into the hostile pillow. He had made a decision in the dark. He was not going to fly home. He was not going to let Harrington's laugh be the last word. He took a shower in the shared bathroom, using a bar of soap that smelled like dish detergent. He put on the same barong, now dry but wrinkled. He borrowed an iron from the Filipino woman who worked at the hostel reception, a cheerful woman named Luz who had been in England for 20 years and still cried every time she heard a Kundiman song. She ironed his barong for him while humming, and she did not ask why he looked like he had not slept. She just said, "Laban lang, anak. Just fight." Ricardo walked back to Oxford University with nothing but his thesis and a new kind of anger, not the hot anger that breaks things but the cold anger that builds them. He found the building where Harrington had his office. He climbed the stairs. He knocked on the door. Harrington opened it, wearing a different tweed jacket, holding a cup of tea. His eyebrows rose when he saw Ricardo. He said, "Oh. You're back." Ricardo said, "Yes, sir. I am." He asked for 15 minutes of Harrington's time to present his thesis again. Harrington smiled that same smile and said he was very busy, perhaps another time. Ricardo did not move. He said, "Sir, with respect, you laughed at me yesterday in front of my peers. You questioned my education and my country. I am not asking you to apologize. I am asking you to listen. If after 15 minutes you still think my work is worthless, I will leave and I will never bother you again." Harrington stared at him. The tea steamed between them. A Filipino janitor walking past with a mop bucket stopped to watch. Harrington stepped aside. "Come in," he said. Ricardo entered the office. It was filled with books from floor to ceiling, leather spines, and gold lettering, the smell of old paper and privilege. Harrington sat behind a massive wooden desk and gestured to a small wooden chair, the kind meant for students. Ricardo sat down. He placed his thesis on the desk. He did not open it. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of string. Harrington raised an eyebrow. Ricardo said, "This is a replica of a tool my ancestors used to measure water flow." He tied the string into a loop and showed how it could be used to calculate volume without numbers. Then he pulled out a small stone, smooth and dark, and placed it on the desk. "This is a stone from the Ifugo rice terraces," he said. "It was placed there by my great-great-grandfather. It has held water for over 100 years without shifting. Then he pulled out a photograph, creased and faded, of his father standing knee-deep in a canal, smiling, holding a wooden shovel. Harrington leaned forward. For the next 15 minutes, Ricardo explained how Filipino engineers built a system of water distribution that rivaled any in the ancient world. He showed how they used no wheels, no pulleys, no iron, only human bodies and stone and bamboo and patience. He explained that the terraces were not just farms but calendars, not just canals but laws, because water rights were written into the very shape of the mountains. He spoke of how the Spanish colonizers had tried to destroy the system and failed. How the Americans had tried to replace it and failed. How modern engineers had studied it and wept because they could not improve it. When he finished, the office was silent. Harrington had not touched his tea. His face had changed. The smile was gone. He looked at Ricardo not as a curiosity but as a scholar. He said, quietly, "Your methodology. Show me your data." Ricardo opened his thesis and pointed to page 47. He showed his calculations, his maps drawn by hand, his interviews translated from Ilocano to English, his footnotes referencing sources in Spanish and Japanese and German. He showed everything. Harrington read in silence for 10 minutes. Then 20. Then an hour passed. Ricardo did not rush him. The Filipino janitor peeked through the window in the door and smiled. Finally, Harrington closed the thesis. He removed his glasses. He rubbed his eyes. He said, "Dr. Cruz, I owe you an apology." Ricardo said nothing. Harrington stood up and walked to his bookshelf. He pulled down a thick volume on Roman aqueducts. He opened it to a page showing a cross-section of stone and concrete. Then he looked at Ricardo's hand-drawn map of the Ifugao canals. He placed them side by side. He said, "The Romans had slaves and engineers and an empire. Your people had none of those things. And yet..." He stopped. He could not finish the sentence. Ricardo finished it for him. "And yet the water still flows," he said. Harrington nodded. He asked if he could keep a copy of the thesis to share with his colleagues. Ricardo said yes. He asked if Ricardo would speak at the Oxford Conference on Indigenous Engineering, which was happening in 3 days. Ricardo said yes. He asked if Ricardo would consider co-authoring a paper with him. Ricardo looked at the man who had laughed at him. He remembered the rain. He remembered the handkerchief. He remembered his mother's voice saying, "No man's laugh can undo what your hands have built." He said, "I will co-author with you on one condition." Harrington waited. Ricardo said, "You must come to the Philippines. You must walk the terraces with me. You must carry a stone up the mountain with your own hands." Harrington stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed. But this time, it was not a mocking laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had just realized he was not as smart as he thought he was. He extended his hand. Ricardo shook it. 3 days later, Ricardo stood at a podium in the same lecture hall where he had been humiliated. But this time, the room was full. Scholars from 12 countries had come to hear him speak. Harrington sat in the front row, taking notes like a student. Ricardo began his presentation. He did not talk about mud walls. He did not talk about Roman aqueducts. He talked about water. He talked about his father. He talked about the string and the stone and the photograph. He talked about a people who carved mountains with their bare hands because their children needed to eat. He projected images of the Ifugao rice terraces onto the large screen behind him, photographs he had taken himself during those 6 months of walking the canals with a rope. The audience saw the green steps climbing into the clouds, the narrow stone channels cutting across cliffs, the brown hands of elderly Filipino farmers placing rocks one by one into flowing water. Ricardo explained how each terrace was a living library. He showed how the position of the sun on the water told farmers when to plant. He showed how the sound of water falling over a certain stone told villagers upstream that someone downstream was stealing. He showed how the system had survived earthquakes, typhoons, wars, and colonization because it was not just engineering. It was love. It was a father building for his son, and that son building for his grandson, and that grandson building for a child he would never meet. Ricardo's voice cracked when he said this. He stopped. He looked down at his notes. The room was completely silent. Then Harrington did something no one expected. He stood up. He turned to face the other scholars. He said, "I owe Dr. Cruz an apology. Not a private one. A public one." He told the room how he had laughed at Ricardo 3 days ago. He admitted he had been arrogant and ignorant. He said he had spent 40 years studying Roman aqueducts and had never once considered that a non-European civilization might have achieved something greater with fewer resources. He said he had been wrong. Then he looked at Ricardo and said, in halting Tagalog he had clearly practiced, "Pasensya na. I am sorry." A gasp went through the room. The Filipino scholars in the back row began to cry. Luz, the receptionist, who had taken the day off to attend, was openly sobbing into her handkerchief. The Filipino janitor with the mop bucket stood near the door, his chest puffed out with pride. Ricardo stood very still at the podium. He had imagined this moment 100 times in the dark of the hostel room. He had imagined screaming at Harrington. He had imagined walking out. He had imagined accepting the apology coldly and saying nothing. But now that the moment was here, he felt no anger. He felt only the strange weight of grace. He said, "Thank you, Dr. Harrington." Then he continued his presentation. He showed more data. He answered questions for 2 hours. He did not gloat. He did not mock. He simply taught. When the conference ended, scholars lined up to shake his hand. A professor from Japan asked if he would collaborate on a study of mountain water systems in Southeast Asia. A professor from Brazil asked if he would speak at a conference in São Paulo. A young Filipino graduate student, a woman with braces and a bright yellow backpack, approached him with tears in her eyes. She said, "Sir, I almost quit my program last year because I felt like I did not belong here. But today you showed me that I do." Ricardo put his hand on her shoulder. He said, "You belong everywhere you decide to belong. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." She hugged him. Then she ran off to call her mother. That night, Ricardo walked back to his hostel. The rain had stopped. The sky was clear for the first time since he had arrived. He sat on the same wet bench near the same canal, but this time the bench was dry and the canal looked peaceful. He pulled out his phone. He had one international call left on his prepaid card. He dialed his mother's number. It was early morning in Manila. She answered on the first ring. "Ma," he said. His voice did not crack this time. "Ma, they loved it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know, Anak. I never stopped believing they would." He told her everything. About the apology. About the standing ovation. About the scholars lining up to shake his hand. About the young Filipino woman who said he had saved her dream. His mother listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Your father would have cried." Ricardo laughed. He said, "I cried enough for both of us." She laughed too. Then she said, "Come home now, Ricardo. The piglets miss you." He asked what piglets. She said, "I bought 2 piglets with the money I got from selling the pig. I told the neighbor I would breed them and pay her back in a year." She paused. Then she said, "I figured my son was going to change the world. The least I could do was change a pig into 2 pigs." Ricardo closed his eyes. He could see her in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she had danced alone, the same wooden spoon in her hand, the same smile that had carried him through every failure. He said, "I love you, Ma." She said, "I love you too, Anak. Now go to sleep. You sound tired." He said goodnight and hung up. He sat on the bench for a long time, looking up at the Oxford stars. He thought about the string in his pocket. He thought about the stone. He thought about his father standing in the canal, smiling, holding a wooden shovel. He thought about the young woman with the yellow backpack. He thought about Luz and the janitor and all the Filipino people who had carried water for him without him ever knowing. Then he stood up. He walked back to the hostel. He packed his bag. The next morning, he flew home. When he landed in Manila, his mother was waiting at the airport. She was wearing a floral dress and holding a sign that said Dr. Ricardo Cruz, World Changer. She had borrowed money from 3 neighbors to buy the sign. He walked through the arrival gate and saw her standing there, small and gray and magnificent. He dropped his bag. He ran to her. He hugged her so hard she squeaked. She said, "Anak, you are crushing my bones." He did not let go. Behind them, a crowd of Filipinos was watching. Some of them recognized him from the news. A young man shouted, "Per, you made us proud." Others began to clap. Ricardo pulled back from his mother and looked at her face. She was crying. He was crying. Everyone was crying. He picked up his bag. He put his arm around his mother. They walked out of the airport together into the hot Manila sun. A jeepney driver honked and waved. A vendor selling fish balls offered him a free stick. A child ran up and asked for his autograph on a piece of cardboard. Ricardo signed it. He wrote, "The water always flows." He did not know if the child would understand. But he knew that somewhere in the mountains of Ifugao, his great-great-grandfather's stone was still holding water in place. And somewhere in Oxford, a British professor was learning how to say sorry in a language he used to mock. And somewhere in a small kitchen in Manila, 2 piglets were growing fat, waiting for a man to come home.